There are two recordings of Aileen Wuornos that are almost impossible to reconcile. In one, she sits in a Florida courtroom and insists, with absolute conviction, that the man she killed attacked her first, that she fought for her life and won. In the other, recorded years later, she stares into a camera and says she killed in cold blood, that she robbed her victims as cold as ice, and that she would do it again. Both women are the same person. Both are speaking, as far as anyone can tell, with total sincerity. That contradiction is the reason this case still matters more than 30 years after the first body was found. Most people know the broad outline. A woman worked the highways of Central Florida. 7 men picked her up, and 7 men lost their lives. She was caught, convicted, and executed. A celebrated film was made. The story, in the popular imagination, has a tidy shape. Monster created, monster stopped. But the official record, the trial transcripts, the appeals, the work of investigative journalists who came later, tells a story far less tidy than the headlines. It's a story about evidence that was never heard, about people who profited from a tragedy, and about a legal system forced to answer a question it has never answered well. What do you do with a defendant who is, by every account, both genuinely dangerous and genuinely unwell? Let's start where the investigation started, not with a killer, but with a string of disappearances no one had connected yet. Between late 1989 and late 1990, middle-aged men began vanishing along Florida's interstates and rural state roads. They were ordinary men, leading ordinary lives: an electronics shop owner from Clearwater, a construction worker, a rodeo hand, a sausage delivery driver, a retired Air Force major who had once served as a police chief and a child abuse investigator, a retired merchant seaman, a trucker who also worked security. Their cases didn't look connected at first. They surfaced in different counties, handled by different agencies days or weeks apart. A man would be reported missing. Sometime later, his car would turn up abandoned in one county and his body in another, often in a wooded area off the highway. Each had been robbed. This is one of the quiet realities of serial cases that television rarely conveys. Crimes spread across jurisdictions are genuinely hard to link. There was no central database flashing a warning, no single detective with the full picture. Each county saw a fragment. It took time and a stroke of luck for anyone to see that the fragments formed a line down the map of Florida. The luck arrived on July the 4th, 1990. A car belonging to one of the missing men, Peter Seams, was found crashed and abandoned in Orange Springs. 2 women had been seen leaving it. Witnesses gave descriptions, and police artists produced sketches that were released to the press. For the first time, the public was told that the person they were looking for might be a woman. That single detail changed everything about how the case would be perceived, and eventually, how it would be sold. The break that ended the investigation didn't come from a dramatic confrontation. It came from paperwork. Wuornos had pawned items belonging to her victims, including a camera traced back to the first man killed. In Florida, pawning property required a thumbprint. That print, sitting quietly in a pawn shop's records, was matched to a woman with a long criminal history and a stack of aliases: Lori Grody, Cammie Marsh Green, Susan Blahovec. The physical evidence pointed in one direction, and it pointed clearly. She was arrested in January 1991 at a biker bar called, with almost unbelievable irony, The Last Resort. What happened next is one of the most overlooked decisions in the entire case, and it's worth slowing down for. Investigators located Tyria Moore, Wuornos' longtime partner, and made her an offer. In exchange for immunity from prosecution, Moore agreed to help. Under police direction, she placed a series of phone calls to Wuornos, pressing her, pleading that she needed to clear her own name. Wuornos, trying to protect the woman she loved, began to talk. Within days, she had confessed. Think about the machinery there. A confession that became the backbone of the prosecution was produced by a person who had received immunity and who would later sign book and movie deals about the case. None of that makes the confession false. Wuornos did kill those men. She said so repeatedly in many settings for the rest of her life. But it tells you something important about how evidence gets manufactured under pressure, and about whose account the system chose to reward and whose it chose to prosecute. When Wuornos confessed, she claimed self-defense. All 7 men, she said, had attacked her or tried to. She had killed to survive. That account did not hold together, and the reasons it failed are a small lesson in how juries weigh credibility. Her story changed with each telling. Details moved. The sequence of events shifted. Prosecutors pointed out fairly that a person describing a real traumatic event tends to be consistent about its core, while Wuornos's core kept sliding. And later, she herself dismantled the self-defense claim. In one of her most revealing statements to a court, she said that her first victim had genuinely assaulted her, but that the others had not. These others did not, she said. The men after the first, by her own admission, had not earned what happened to them. So we are left with a defendant who appears to have told the truth and a lie in the same breath, and who may not have fully been able to tell which was which. Hold that thought. It becomes the central problem of the entire case. When Wuornos went on trial in early 1992, she was tried for a single killing, the first one. But the jury heard about all of them. That was made possible by a feature of Florida law sometimes called the Williams Rule. Ordinarily, prosecutors cannot tell a jury about a defendant's other alleged crimes because the risk is obvious. Jurors may convict someone for being a bad person rather than for the specific act in front of them. The Williams Rule carves out an exception. If other offenses help establish a pattern, a motive, or a method, they can come in. For a defendant claiming self-defense, this was devastating. It is one thing to argue that a single violent encounter forced your hand. It is much harder to make that argument when the jury has just been told that 6 other men met similar ends. Self-defense is a claim about an isolated moment. The Williams Rule made sure the jury never saw an isolated moment. They saw a series. It took the jury less than 2 hours to convict. They recommended death by a vote of 12 to nothing. And here is where the case turns from a crime story into something more troubling. Wuornos had always said her first victim attacked her. The prosecution treated this as the desperate invention of a guilty woman, and police reportedly found nothing dirty on the man to support it. But they had not actually looked very hard. In November 1992, after the conviction, after the death sentence, a Dateline NBC reporter named Michelle Gillen ran the first victim's name through criminal records that had been available all along. What she found was that he had served roughly a decade in another state for a violent sexual assault, and had spent years committed to a facility that treated sexual offenders. Records from that institution noted, in the clinical language of the era, strong sociopathic trends. Sit with the timeline. The detectives had told the public there was nothing to corroborate Wuornos's claim. A journalist found the corroboration with a database search. Had investigators simply checked federal records, they would have known that the one man Wuornos always insisted had genuinely attacked her had a documented history of exactly that kind of violence. Wuornos's defense did try to raise this at trial. They sought to introduce the man's record. The judge refused to allow it. So the jurors who sentenced her to death weighed her self-defense claim without the single piece of evidence most capable of supporting it. Now, does this exonerate her? No, and it's important to be precise about this. By her own later admission, the other men did not attack her. A documented history of violence in one victim does not transform 6 other robberies and killings into self-defense. But it does something else. It reveals that the investigation that sent a woman to death row was incomplete in a way that happened to cut against the defendant, and that the courtroom, by excluding the record, sealed that incompleteness into the verdict. A jury is only as reliable as the evidence it's allowed to see. To understand why this case was investigated and reported the way it was, you have to understand the gold rush that formed around it. The phrase, "first female serial killer," is irresistible to a newsroom. And once it attached to Wuornos, the story stopped being a series of homicides and became a property. According to reporting that emerged after the trial, 3 of the detectives connected to the case made book and movie deals and later resigned. Tyria Moore, the partner who had received immunity, reportedly signed deals of her own. The officers insisted their intentions were pure, claiming they meant to direct money to a victim's fund. Whatever the truth of that, the optics were corrosive. The people responsible for building the case against Wuornos stood to profit from the version of events they helped create. This is the rare true crime story where the commercialization isn't a footnote. It's a structural fact about the case. When the people gathering and presenting evidence have a financial stake in a particular narrative, every decision they made deserves a second look. It doesn't prove misconduct. It does explain why so many later observers found the official account harder to trust than it first appeared. There was another set of facts the sentencing jury never fully absorbed. And this time, the failure belonged partly to Wuornos's own defense. Her early life was, by any standard, catastrophic. She was born in Michigan to a teenage mother and a father she never knew. A man later imprisoned for a horrific crime against a child who died by suicide behind bars. Her mother left when she was small. She and her brother were raised by grandparents in a home Wuornos described as violent. She became pregnant as a child herself, gave birth at 15, and surrendered the baby. Soon after, she was put out of the house and, for a time, survived alone in the woods. This is the context in which a person's capacity for trust, for impulse control, for distinguishing a real threat from an imagined one, is supposed to form. In Wuornos's case, almost none of the ordinary scaffolding existed. During the appeals, it emerged that childhood friends and neighbors who knew this history were willing to testify, and were never called. Several said the media had contacted them, but her own public defender's office never did. In a death penalty case, the sentencing phase exists precisely so a jury can hear who a defendant is and how they came to be that way. The jury that voted 12-0 for death heard only a fraction of it. None of this is offered to excuse what she did. It's offered because the law itself demands that this information be weighed, and in her case, the weighing never properly happened. It's worth pausing on that phrase again. America's first female serial killer. Because it shaped public understanding more than any fact in the case, and it was wrong twice over. It was wrong historically. Women had committed serial murders long before her, and it was wrong descriptively. The filmmaker Nick Broomfield, who interviewed Wuornos repeatedly in the years before her death, has argued for decades that she doesn't fit the profile at all. Serial killers, in the conventional understanding, tend to kill in a signature way, refining a method that functions almost like a compulsion. Wuornos had nothing like that. Her killings grew out of volatile, chaotic encounters and a life lived at the edge of survival, not out of a ritual she was perfecting. Why does the label matter? Because labels do cognitive work. Once the public filed her under serial killer, a particular set of assumptions activated automatically: calculation, predation, an absence of any inner life worth examining. That framing made it easier to dismiss the self-defense claim, easier to overlook the buried evidence, easier to move quickly toward execution. The name we give a person shapes the questions we're willing to ask about them. In Wuornos's case, the name shut questions down. By the late 1990s, Wuornos had stopped fighting. She fired her attorneys, dropped her appeals, and asked the state to carry out her sentence. She wrote that she was sane, that she knew exactly what she had done, that she felt nothing but hatred and would kill again if she could. She insisted over and over that she was competent, and at the very same time, she was describing being tortured in her cell by sonic weapons. She accused prison staff of contaminating her food to drive her insane. She spoke of mind control. In her final filmed interview, the day before her death, she swung from calm conversation to fury within seconds and delivered a rant about society and the police having railroaded her. This is the paradox the law could not resolve. The constitutional standard for whether a person can be executed, set by the Supreme Court in Ford versus Wainwright, is strikingly narrow. The prisoner must understand that they are being executed and why. It does not ask whether they are mentally healthy. It does not ask whether their decision to stop fighting is the product of a sound mind or a deteriorating one. It asks only whether they grasp the basic fact of their punishment. By that minimal measure, a panel of state-appointed psychiatrists found Wuornos competent. The governor, who had briefly halted the execution for that very evaluation, allowed it to proceed. Critics noted that it was an election year, and that appearing firm on crime carried obvious political value. A woman who was, in the words of people who spent hours with her, visibly unwell, was found legally fit to die, because the legal test was never designed to measure the kind of unwellness she had. That is the deepest reason this case endures. It sits on the fault line between two things our justice system struggles to hold at once: accountability and mental illness. Wuornos was responsible for terrible harm. She was also, by a great deal of evidence, profoundly damaged and possibly delusional at the end. The system was asked to weigh both, and it resolved the tension by applying a standard so narrow that the harder question never had to be answered. She was executed by lethal injection in October 2002. She declined a special last meal and asked only for a cup of coffee. Her final words were strange and unmoored, a reference to sailing with the rock, to a mothership, to coming back. A year later, the film Monster introduced her to a mass audience, and its lead performance won an Academy Award. For most viewers, that film is where the story begins and ends. But the film, like the headlines before it, is a frame. And the most valuable thing this case can teach is to be suspicious of frames, to ask what a database search might have turned up, what a jury was never shown, who stood to profit from a particular telling, and what questions a convenient label quietly made us stop asking. The verdict was that Aileen Wuornos was a murderer. The record supports it, but a verdict answers only the question of guilt. It was never built to answer the questions this case actually raises. And those questions are still open. If the jury that sentenced Aileen Wuornos to death had been allowed to hear her first victim's documented history of violence, do you think it would have changed their decision? And should a confession obtained through a deal that rewarded the witness ever carry that much weight? Share your perspective in the comments. Cases like this remind us that some questions continue long after the headlines fade. If you found this documentary informative, consider subscribing for more carefully researched true crime stories. We'd also love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next documentary.